because this is another topic that I anticipate is by the time he's finished, I'll probably have the same type of comment I did last week about how good it was, but also how scary it was, if you recall that with talking about cyber last week. So today we have with us Dr. Frank Jones. He's a professor of security studies in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the United States Army War College, where he holds the General George C. Marshall Chair of Military Studies. He retired from the Office of the Secretary of Defense as a member of the Senior Executive Service in 2006 after more than 30 years of federal service. His final government position was Principal Director for Strategy, Plans and Resources in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense. He holds a PhD degree from the School of Government and International Relations at Griffin University in Australia. He has written a book, 2 monographs, and several book chapters and articles on various national security issues. He recently completed a book on Senator Sam Nunn, which includes a discussion of the senator's arms control efforts during the Cold War. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jones.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here, and I thank you for taking time from your schedule to join me on this rather, I hope it won't be too fearful a topic, but certainly one that should make us concerned given what we hear in the news about treaties and negotiations and relationships between or among various countries or nation states. And before I begin with the first slide, I just also want to say that anything I say today is purely my own personal opinion. It's not the U.S. government position or policy necessarily, or that of the Defense Department or the U.S. Army. And I promised that I would be candid as I could in the question and answer period, and I will keep that promise. So the title, if you had a chance to read the Great Decisions chapter or section for this year, and as Michael pointed out, is negotiations, nuclear negotiations, back to the future. And I thought that's a very interesting way to frame this type of topic, nuclear negotiations. But there's a challenge in that. And the challenge in that is the word negotiations. Why do you conduct negotiations? What is its purpose? What is the value of negotiating with another state, another party, regarding a particular type of weapon, in this case, nuclear weapons? And so what I would like to do this afternoon is to broaden that, to give you a sense of how we might approach this idea as we read newspapers or listen to the news and think about nuclear negotiations and, as I've titled this, arms control. And I'm going to have to say that there's going to have to be some theory in here. And I hope your eyes don't glaze over, but my students, when I say theory, sometimes over at the War College, look at me like I'm insane. And there's some practice, because how scholars think about this and how people in policy and military leaders and political leaders think about this is often not the same. And so I'll try to give you some tools or ways to look at this afternoon, and I'll take some time to talk about some case studies for which many of you are probably familiar. So I want to talk about the strategic environment, the world we live in today, this idea of policy. What are we trying to accomplish? What is the political objective that a state, a nation, pursues? This idea of deterrence, deterring an enemy. Arms control itself, what do we mean by that term? What is arms control? How do we define it? Some case studies, some of which you will be very familiar. Negotiations, the art, really, of negotiating an agreement. The role of Congress, and I would argue that that is the forgotten branch, that we tend to think of these types of relationships that are done over a table between two parties, as we saw in Hanoi just recently, as if it were just those were the two really parties that are really germane to this. And I would argue that Congress is also germane because of the way the US government works. And lastly, what are the challenges? What assumptions were made after 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union, its dissolution? What type of world do we live in today? And where should we be going in terms of thinking about arms control? Now, if you remember the picture that was just on the preceding slide, you probably noticed there were two missile systems there. The one on your left was the SS-20. And the one on the other side was the Pershing II, who were both weapons that were at the center of a current discussion that just took place over the last 2 months. Whether or not the United States should continue to be part of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement, same with Russia with its predecessor, the Soviet Union. And so if you were to walk into the Smithsonian, you would see those two, exactly those missiles on exhibit. And so I'll get to the 87 discussion about the INF Treaty. Now, I have to try to narrow this huge topic down to 45 to 60 minutes. And so there are some things that I'm not going to touch upon very much. And you see them right here on this slide. And just to keep it simple, if you will, on such an arcane topic. So if you had a chance to read Professor B's article that he wrote on Back to the Future and negotiations on nuclear weapons, he breaks this down into 5 races. So these are the races in history in which certain parties were interacting with each other and they were trying to either attain nuclear weapons or deny or restrain, is a better word, nuclear weapons and their proliferation. I think we're at a point in time, I would argue, that there are 5 races here and that 4 of them are still relevant today. The first one, obviously, is the World War II outcome. But if you look at the other one is a vertical race. In other words, how do arsenals get bigger? And the Soviet Union and the United States built, as you'll recall, huge arsenals of nuclear capability. A horizontal race, how many other states become nuclear states? I think we're wrestling with that today. How do we prevent non-state actors, terrorists, and others from getting nuclear weapons? And what about the future? What about space? Is it a contested domain? Is cyber, which was, I guess, the topic of the last meeting, how does that affect nuclear weapons? And it is a topic of consideration among scientists and engineers and people who study arms control. How might it affect nuclear weapons? So, what motivates states? Well, I would suggest to you that this is as old as Thucydides 2,500 years ago. The idea that we are motivated as human beings, as entities, political entities, and as the ancient Athenians said, the primary one is fear. We walk down streets in our towns, Carlisle, whatever, and we have a psychological idea of something about whether we're secure or not. Do we feel secure? And why might we feel secure, or why might we feel fearful? So fear is a very potent emotion. The second thing is, they noticed, the ancient Athenians, that it was also honor. And we still have the word honor in American society and other societies, but we might sometimes call it prestige. Respect might be another term. And we all, nations and human beings, have interests. What benefits me? And the fundamental one for states, like the United States or countries, whichever term you wish to use, is its actual survival, its existence. So that's the world according to the Federation of Atomic Scientists, their estimate of the number of nuclear weapons in the world. And I just leave that up there for a minute just to show you the disparity between what the US and Russia have. versus other nuclear states. And rightfully, the FAS, Federation of Atomic Scientists, is right. North Korea is a nuclear state. Otherwise, why would you be talking about denuclearization? But that is a shot that if that were the only picture I showed today, or only graphic that I showed, that you would come to some conclusions which I think would be somewhat misleading. Because what we also have to recognize is that the world that many of us grew up in, I count myself among this, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, through the Reagan administration in particular, is that you can see that the size of the arsenals, the growth of the arsenals began to go down. And what we've seen over the last several decades, principally since the Cold War, is a movement from putting ceilings to actually reducing. And so I think that's the good news story. There are fewer weapons in the world than there were in 1981, as an example. And I think we also forget that there are a number of treaties that still exist today that we should take some heart in that are still applicable to nuclear weapons and are still abided by. And they create nuclear-free zones, in other words, where nuclear weapons can't be, or they exist to limit or reduce the number of nuclear weapons. And so while I talked to a very senior official a few weeks ago, and his comment to me was the old structure, the old framework of arms control was crumbling. When he was talking about that, he was talking about the Cold War. The architecture of the Cold War was crumbling, but not in its entirety. And so if we take individual discrete events, INF or others, and just look at it that way, then we get a very different picture. And I don't want to try to moderate any fear. See, that's a primary motive, right, that it may occur in your minds. But there also have been some very telling withdrawals. The ABM treaty, the United States withdrew in 2002. It has an impact, which I'll speak to. The INF treaty, which is most recently, both the United States and Russia have indicated their withdrawal of that, and there's a period of time which they get to make that a date certain, in which they get to make that, put it in place, and the so-called Iranian deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which the United States withdrew from. So those are also sending signals when you withdraw from treaties, when you say you will no longer abide by them, either by the withdrawal or violation, you are sending a signal to others about what possibly you may be thinking about and what are your intentions. And we don't always know what other people's intentions are, do we? Bernard Brodie is a well-known, perhaps not so well-known today, but certainly during his own time, a well-known political scientist. Brodie was serving in World War II in the United States Navy. He had a PhD from Yale University in political science. And the day that the bombs, or the time period in which the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he said to his wife, "This changes everything. These type of weapons change everything that I thought I knew about war." And in 1946, he writes about the absolute weapon. He's talking about the atomic bomb at that time. And he makes this statement that the chief purpose of the military establishment is not to win a war. It's to avert one now because of the catastrophic impact that nuclear weapons, or will become nuclear weapons as we know them, will have on other societies. And, as you well know, it's not just where the bomb lands. The atmospheric and other environmental effects that has. And so he was very much a man of great foresight. But he also was telling us how we have to think about the use of these weapons, or, as he's arguing, the non-use of these weapons. What is their value? How do you take something that is conceived of as being offensive to win a war, to attain victory, vice when you have them for a certain purpose other than that, to deter, to prevent someone from using them against you. And so from this comes an idea about how the relationship of any type of military power should be used. And my former colleague put this together, and I've always found it most helpful. Because ultimately, we don't use an instrument like the military, whether we use them with conventional force or otherwise, unless there's a political purpose in mind. What is the objective that we are trying to achieve? What is the policy we want to achieve? And how will we use that instrument? Will we defeat an enemy? Will we coerce them, change their actions, potential or actual? Will we reassure? We spend a lot of time reassuring allies. Japan, Republic of Korea or South Korea, NATO allies. Certainly that's been in the news over the last few years. And then we provide certain types of assistance as well. And then you'll notice down there on the bottom, coming out of the coercion block, this idea of deterrence. Trying to prevent or avert some negative action on the part of an adversary. How do you do that? Well, for many of you, you may remember that we had literally hundreds of thousands of American troops in Western Europe in NATO. Conventional capability at one level, with a threshold, and then tactical nuclear weapons and strategic weapons through ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so we had a delineation of how military power could be used based on what? Based on the belief that somehow the Soviet Union was going to move westward and attack. So how do you keep the Russians, or the Soviets at the time, from moving westward? Can you, looking at the balance of power, where they have military might, strong numbers of tanks and personnel, can you get there at time with reinforcements? Do you have enough capability to stop what was believed to be a very large armor formation that would attack, etc.? All of that was part of the calculus. But nuclear weapons adds another dimension to this. So while deterrence is this using a threat of reprisal, is another way to think about this. You can build up a force to deny it. September 11th. What happened after September 11th in terms of how do you deter Al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups? Well, we saw police officers in airports. We saw barriers being put up, certainly changed the dimensions of how to get even on Carlisle barracks. We used ways to really form in the mind of the adversary that it was not worth the trouble to go ahead and make the attack. So it's deterrence by denial. But you have to have capability, and you have to be credible. You have to be able, the person on the other end, the adversary, the opponent, must believe that you're capable of deterring that attack. And the opponent makes a calculation, a cost-benefit calculation, and determines risk about whether I should take that step or not. In nuclear deterrence, something else was at work. Countries had nuclear arsenals and doctrines about how they would use those weapons. And they believed that the way they did not want to start the war, they wanted to be able to survive a first strike. And the way you survive a first strike is so that you have the ability of deterrence by punishment, that I can punish you if you attack me first. I'm not going to use my weapons first. I must be able to absorb an attack, survive it, and have enough capability that I will use it in retaliation. The second strike capability. And the argument was that this brought stability in the system, in the government, the relationship, if you will. And you remember the world of bipolarity, the US versus the Soviet Union. We looked at the world very much in that as a kind of a seesaw that had to be balanced out in terms of capability, et cetera. And the argument was that if we had nuclear war, it was a failure. Deterrence had failed. The idea, the psychological value of it had been lost. And you remember that, and this still exists today, extended deterrence. So there wouldn't be proliferation of nuclear weapons. We guaranteed our allies that we would back them up, conventionally and with nuclear weapons. This causes some problems in the 1980s, as many of you recur. If you were living in Europe in the 1980s, you probably well remember this, and I'll talk about it in a few minutes. But Japan, South Korea, etc., in order for them not to create their own arsenals of nuclear weapons, we guaranteed their security through alliance structures, a legal treaty obligation. And we also defined it as a way to ensure that they didn't proliferate, that they didn't become nuclear states themselves. And so if you think back to 1970, the nuclear non-proliferation, the idea that was that nuclear states would eventually disarm, and non-nuclear states would not seek to own nuclear weapons. So Sir Michael Quinlan, the late Sir Michael Quinlan, a British nuclear strategist himself who worked in the Ministry of Defense, and then after he retired began talking about his understanding of deterrence, made these comments about why was this successful? Why didn't we have nuclear war? And he offered these features, if you will, both political features and strategic or operational features. And you'll notice he said, part of this is predictability. I know my opponent. I understand how that opponent thinks and reacts. Now, sometimes that can be wrong. You think your opponent's almost exactly like you, which is often not the case. That there was a recognition of what it cost to have nuclear war, the catastrophic aspect of this. That we generally understood how the enemy made use of forces, their formations, their strengths, etc., and that we had a willingness to engage in some type of reciprocal understanding about how we would have control of nuclear weapons, and that we would use certain other mechanisms to build confidence about who we were. And that could be as simple, when you think about it, as the Bolshoi Ballet coming to the United States, or American jazz performers going over there. It was this idea that we could build relationships, that by knowing the other, we could come to some idea of cooperation, but at least coexistence. But, as I said, there's also this second element. Reduce the vulnerability, in other words, have that second strike capability, but also recognize that we had to safely have custody, handling, operational control of these weapons because of their danger. And so, as Michael mentioned in the 1970s, just finished a book on Senator Nunn. In the 1970s, he goes over to Europe to look at tactical nuclear weapons. He's very concerned that what's happening with the United States and its NATO allies is that we're going to make very quick use of tactical nuclear weapons should the Soviets come across into West Germany. And what he finds is an army, in his view, based upon his own observations, as he looked at army units, he finds an army that he finds is largely demoralized, that is not living up to this safe design and custody. He finds security problems there, and he reports that directly back to the Secretary of Defense at the time, and indicates we have to come to some better understanding of what we're doing with these weapons because they are not well controlled. And so this aspect begins to be looked at all through the 70s and 80s, et cetera, because it is, again, a weak point. Now, I've used that word security dilemma in the opening slide. What does that really mean? Well, I didn't highlight the first 2 points because I think that that's great if we were going to have a nice, great conversation about theory here. But I want to point to the 2 that are in yellow that are highlighted because I think those are the important parts because that's really what the essence of security dilemma is. I fear your military capability. I want to increase my own capability. You notice me increasing my capability, which only engenders more fear in me. And so it begins to spiral as states begin to look at what are other states doing. What are the Russians doing when they create and have hypersonic vehicles or glide vehicles or missiles? What are they doing when they build missiles that are now can shoot in a range that was once considered a treaty obligation not to have? What happens when North Korea nuclearizes? People feel less secure. States feel less secure. Political leaders feel less secure. And what does that create? It creates, obviously creates some type of arms race is what usually comes out of it. And we hear that already today. If you've been reading the news, there is the arms control community today saying, when we walk away from the INF, we are essentially starting a new arms race with Russia. For a political scientist who studies this is a perfect case of the security dilemma. What are the Russians doing? How does that affect my own security, the United States? So Robert Jervis, who is another political scientist, and I am, as you heard, a political scientist by education, said, what's the purpose of arms control? It rests on how you think wars begin. How do they begin? Why do wars occur? And usually there are three reasons that John Maurer and others have come to. The belief that it's cultural, that it's part of the DNA, if you will, of your state, of your nation, of your country, particularly if they have large military industrial complexes, as President Eisenhower warned us about attitudes about war. Are they winnable? Are nuclear wars winnable, people asked in the 1950s and subsequently? Is it about stability, that we can actually create relationships with other states, about the deployment of defensive weapons that either limit or prohibit other weapons that are offensive in nature, in other words, the offense-defense balance? Or are we trying to promote our own advantage over that of an adversary? And that'll become, I'll show you the case study why these are one way to look at it. This is an old definition. 1961, Morton Halperin and Thomas Schelling. But I think I've underlined the words I think that are important. One, arms control has to be understood, in my mind, and I think this is true about many who deal with this, is it has to be understood as part of a military strategy. It is not simply a diplomatic or political issue. Second of all, it has to create the avoidance of war. It has to minimize, as you see, the costs and risk of armed competition, which I just mentioned as part of the security dilemma, and curtail the scope and violence, should it occur. That's a tall order, but I think it's a good beginning or a good foundation because it has to be understood within the context of weapons, which are a military means. And so it has to be thought of as part of a military strategy. Recent discussion with a senior military officer about the United States leaving the so-called Iran deal. And his statement to me was, okay, if I leave the Iran deal, if the JCPOA, the Iran deal, is off the table, what do I have to put in its place in order to ensure that the relationship that I have, the military competition that I have with Iran, is minimized in terms of their ability to gain military advantage? Something to think about. So I would argue that a practitioner looks at the arms control and sees it in this light. A way to actually pursue their political objectives, to halt an arms race, to stop it or restrain it, to prevent miscalculation or misperception. Somebody creates that, and we have accidental nuclear war, which people have worried about for decades. The stability, the costs of destruction, the consequences of that. So Michael Zhang mentioned that I worked in the last job was in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense. Part of our responsibility was to look at the consequences, to think about the unthinkable. What are the consequences of chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear attack in the United States? Sobering. I'll just leave that in one word. An antidote to nuclear war. And I think, and we're seeing this more and more, how do you respond to alliance concerns? If your allies do not believe you can be credible in keeping them safe as well, do they begin to look for their own way to stay and survive? Do they look for their own weapons? And I think this is important as well. How are we to look at arms control? Agreements, verification, we have to have some idea of that people are actually complying with the agreement. And then if they're not, what sanctions or punishments can we impose on them for violation? So I see arms control as a continuum between arms races that I talked about, competitive, and arms control, which is restraint. The willingness of two or more states to restrain themselves in some way from either growing a nuclear arsenal or somehow breaking out and creating themselves as nuclear states. And I think there are a number of factors that have to go into that, and some of those are listed here. How do you perceive the other? What intelligence do you have? And I mean both technical intelligence. Can you see what they're doing? Maybe you don't have access. And do you have political intelligence? Can you understand the persons on the other side of the table that you're negotiating with? Do you understand who they are, what their intentions are, what their goals are, etc.? How much strength do you have in your bargaining position? How much military power do you have? Are there other elements of power, economic, that might be helpful in producing an agreement? And do you have the will? Are the people of your nation, your country, willing to go ahead and vote for or be in favor of arms control? So I think there are a couple of ways to look at this, and you'll have to excuse me if I try to break this down, but one way you can look at this is, how should you look at it? Now, political scientists love to look at this and say, okay, it's one of those three ways of analyzing the problem. And I would say, no, it's actually all three of those. You have to be able to look at the individuals that you're dealing with. You have to understand the state in which you're working with. In other words, what is Russia today? What's its government? What's its needs, et cetera? How's its economy working? Its social system. And then largely, what's happening in the world? So I take you back to 1963 to 1972. That's the context for the U.S. in a very encapsulated way. That's the view of what's happening in the world during that period. 62, there's the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which the United States and the Soviet Union almost come very close, one of two times perhaps in our history in which we come very close to nuclear war. There are domestic concerns. President Kennedy is killed in November of '63, and President Johnson, not only does he deal with the Vietnam War, but the Great Society program, et cetera. And so there's those domestic issues. And then there's the risk reduction, the recognition coming out of the Cuban Missile Crisis that we have to have a hotline between the two political entities so that they can talk to each other. What is Khrushchev? Nikita Khrushchev, you may remember. This looks like to him, while he's trying to prove to his others, members of the Politburo, of his strength right after this, he is humiliated to some degree. There's a fear of US military superiority. Their economy, the Soviet economy, is in trouble, particularly in the agricultural sector. But they also recognize that the Cuban Missile Crisis was a very much a dramatic event in how they should see the relationship between themselves and the United States. So just have you think back to that period of time. So what were the US interests? How did the US think about it? We wanted détente by 1969, 70s. This was Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger's idea that we were going to lessen the tensions between the United States and Soviet Union. And we were going to do that with two things. Politically, we were going to look at an arms control treaty, which results in SALT I and the ABM treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and we were going to have trade agreements because the Russians needed that for their agricultural sector. How can both parties find some acceptable agreement there? The cartoon shows, obviously, Richard Nixon not in a ship, not even in a good old rowboat, but on a raft made of a document, the SALT Agreement. And there's the picture. Richard Nixon, Brezhnev shaking hands, having ratified the agreement. Equilibrium in the system that I mentioned. The idea that each has its security, that they're not. There's a limitation on their arsenals. The executive branch, the president and the Senate agree to a treaty, so we have both branches of government in agreement. The Politburo also buys into it, and you have individuals like Kissinger whose idea of détente really flows until through the 1970s, through the Ford administration, and then actually into the Carter administration. So one treaty at a particular point in time based upon the common interests, or at least shared interests, partially, of two states who are willing to recognize that they almost came to severe blows a few years earlier. But it's also a game, and I don't mean that in a game like Monopoly. I mean it's a two-level game because negotiations are occurring at two different levels. They're occurring at an international level among parties, presidents, and of different countries or dictators. And they're also happening domestically. And so the chief negotiator, however you want to define that term, say it's a president of the United States, has to convince another head of state, head of government, to go along with it. But it also must, in the American system, convince the American people and the branch of government that represents them, the Congress of the United States, that the agreement is a valuable step forward. They have to create what's called win sets. In other words, domestic interest groups have to be assured that ratifying this agreement, that's the act of the president to ratify, some type of government backing that they are behind this, the American people included, is when both of these occur and there's overlap between how each side sees this agreement as working out to its best interests. So we're back to interests again. And these are the actors, and this is just notional, these are the actors in the United States who are involved in arms control. Now, when we think of this, we think often of the Senate because of treaties in Article 1. But if we look back historically, we realize that the House of Representatives also plays a role because in cases where there were arms buildup, such as the Reagan administration, and you remember the large infusion of money into the defense budget, that had to go through both houses, and the House of Representatives also had to ensure that the defense budget went up. And you may remember there were systems such as the MX missile system, Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars as it was known, part of this process as well. And the American public. So what's the context in this period after SALT II? After SALT I. Well, the focus changes to the so-called third world, the underdeveloped or developing world. And as I mentioned, you have the buildup under President Reagan. You have the deployment of those weapon systems, the Pershing II and the ground-launched cruise missile. You have friction in NATO between political leaders and their publics, and also between militaries to some degree. And you have a nuclear freeze movement that you may recall in the United States. And you have one in the picture shows you on the right, protests in NATO nations about putting Pershing IIs and ground-launched cruise missiles with nuclear warheads into their countries, particularly in Germany. And on the Soviet side, the Soviets put the 22 SS-20 in there, and they also created a propaganda campaign against the United States against the missile deployment. So that's the context. But that's a very different context than the one we just had a minute ago. So what was Ronald Reagan trying to achieve in 1986-87? If you remember, he goes to Reykjavik in Iceland and almost gives away, both he and Gorbachev agree to do away with all the weapons of that. But Gorbachev wants one thing. He wants Star Wars to go away, and Mr. Reagan won't allow for that. But they do agree that maybe they can find a class of weapons that they can give up. And so Reagan begins originally with this idea of a dual track. We'll negotiate an arms agreement, a treaty, but we'll also deploy the Pershing IIs and the cruise missiles. And so it's a parallel track, a dual track. What happens? 81 to 83, as soon as that's the first phase of the negotiations, and the Soviets walk out in 83 because of the deployment. 2 years later, 1985, they re-enter the negotiation. What changed? The man to President Reagan's right-hand side, Mr. Gorbachev. That made a difference. Probably the most important difference was the political change. Not the only thing, but certainly part of it. And so here you have really, in a sense, the chief negotiator being the president and the general secretary of the Soviet Union. You have an executive branch behind the president, for the most part. Some uneasiness in some departments. You have a Senate that now is controlled by the Democrats who favor arms control. You have interest groups like the Arms Control Association and others who are interested in seeing this pass, this agreement come to. And so you have on the American side a group of like-minded people happening at the same time. Gorbachev is able to convince, he's looking for reform economically and to move money out of their defense budget into the economy. And you also have the importance of NATO solidarity. NATO stands with the Americans. There are multiple levels of negotiation. Negotiations are happening at the political level, among political people with the North Atlantic Council and with the military committee. And so they're being briefed by both the by the political leadership and by the military representative that's on the negotiating team. And if you know General Burns, who lives in the area, he was the Joint Chiefs negotiating representative on that particular treaty of INF. So the context has changed. But somehow we get agreement. Now we come up to more contemporary times. A discussion about a reset with the Russians, particularly during the Obama administration. But there's a foreign policy consensus that broke down, I would suggest to you, first started to unravel with Vietnam and starts to fall apart because no one's sure what the threat is after 1991 when the Soviet Union goes away. And there's elections. And I highlight the 2010 elections because that election is the election just before the treaty goes to the Senate for its resolution of advice and consent. And so there was an argument in the Senate, which was controlled by the Democrats at the time, but they did not have the majority by which they was veto-proof majority, about whether or not at the end of the year they were going to get this treaty through the Senate before the elections in 2010. And Alexei Arbatov, who's a Russian scholar, said, we also had another factor. We had a whole community of people who understood nuclear weapons and arms control that was no longer there. They had retired. They'd left government. And that was true on both sides. both on the Russian side and the United States. And as you can see, START 1 was viewed by the Russians as being detrimental. They were at disadvantage. They believed they had given up more than the United States had given up. It was an attempt to reduce tensions, but that wasn't always happening. They worried about their own systems, where they were being obsolete. They had modernized their systems. And lastly, there was a lack of trust. Why? Because the United States had withdrawn from 2002 from the ABM Treaty, and the Russians saw that as a signal that the United States could not be trusted to hold on to arms control. That's the Russian perception of what was going on. Whether it's true or not is immaterial. That was their perception. What President Obama, as the cartoon represents there, is what he was dealing with was the domestic. Could he get a reduction in the arms through the New START, which is a strategic treaty for reduction of nuclear weapons? Could he do that through a political reset and arms control? And the answer is yes, barely. He was able to get enough votes in the Senate to get a resolution of advice and consent. And Medvedev, who was then the president, had to bring together in his own country a belief that this was somehow not disadvantageous to the Russians. So context matters. Who is involved matters. And that brings us to process. How do you get an arms control agreement, other than understanding some of this? I suggest to you that for America, and this is a long process. It takes years to do this. It's not something that happens overnight. As I just suggested to you, between 1981 and 1986 was the period with the INF Treaty, actually, with a break there because of the walkout. I think these are the considerations. This is a complex process. Any type of negotiation is. But there's so much at stake here. What are we trying to do? How do I define what I want? How do I define what an intermediate range nuclear ballistic missile is? Is your definition the same as mine? Can we come to some agreement that is between something that has a range of 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers? What should be included in there? What platforms? Air, submarines, land from silos? Can we agree to that? Can we figure out how flexible we can be? Can I minimize my ego and not take everything personally? Do I have a model about how this might work out? Do I know when it's time to walk away from the room? Can I build confidence and trust? So in interviewing former arms controllers, so much of this goes on outside the room. Dinners, walks in the woods, other types of ways to build confidence and become to know the person across the table. Trust, confidence. And then it isn't one strategy, it's 3 strategies. What are we trying to achieve? How do we achieve it? And how much time am I willing to invest in this? How am I going to do this? Am I going to do it incrementally? Or am I going to try to make the big deal? There are also some other challenges. Who am I negotiating with? What do I know about that person? What challenges does he or she face behind the table for those who aren't at the table? Are there other people that can influence? Are there other states or nations that might have an influence? Can I rely on the Chinese or the Russians to help me if I'm dealing with North Korea? How do I influence? Do I provide incentives? Do I provide concessions? Do I tell you if you will do this, I will do that? Who goes first? What's the cost of doing this? And how do I use the media appropriately? How do I get them to believe and not raise expectations that I will walk away with a success because I might not get success? And so, again, it's issues, information, understanding time, understanding process, and how do these all relate. If I'm going to go and extend New START, which runs out in a couple of years, I have to understand what START meant and New START meant if we were going to extend it. I'm sure I should have said it that way. I have to understand what went on before. So before Ambassador Begin went and started talking to the North Koreans, he gathered everybody he could get from the first two administrations or three administrations that dealt with the North Koreans: Clinton, Bush, and Obama. What do we know about the people that I'm going to be have that exchange with? What do they tell me? How has this changed? What is their behavior? How do they act? I adapted this from Dennis Ross, who many of you might recognize the name, for a long time was the Middle East negotiator for the United States in a number of administrations. And again, it points to these same points about trust and understanding and concessions. And something we have been talking a lot about with our students at the War College about empathy. Not sympathy, but empathy. The ability to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and understand the world from their perspective. You don't have to agree with it. Just have to try to understand it. And for us, as I said, that Congress is important. What relationships exist between the president and the legislative branch? How far polarized are we as a nation, politically? What messages are we sending? What is the relationship between our party, political party, and the committees? There are three major committees that deal with these issues: foreign relations type committees, armed services, and intelligence. And the fact that we actually have two chambers, Senate and the House, that have to be considered, even if it's only. So how do I measure success? Other than someone signs it and it goes into effect, becomes the force. Well, I think sometimes the conditions have to change. What changed? Did somebody get economic relief? Did they get an economic benefit, as the trade agreements were because of SALT I? Did somebody gain or retain a military advantage? The argument we're probably going to hear from the Russians over the next few years is that we made all the concessions, we, the Russians, made the major concessions in New START. Allegedly, according to a Reuters report, President Trump has the exact opposite view. An alliance. What will happen? Will South Korea become a nuclear state? Will Japan become a nuclear state? Will we have a global INF treaty? Are you willing to compromise? Are you willing to take the fact that they may actually have more warheads, but that may not matter that much? How many warheads do you need to be successful? And the value of dialogue itself. At the end of the Cold War and the immediate aftermath, there were a number of predictions or assumptions made by people who study this topic as to what was going to happen next. But as one scholar has pointed out, some of this hasn't come to pass. Some of those assumptions are not valid. And as Professor B offers then, what are those options for the future? Do we actually have disarmament where nuclear weapons are banned? I think that's very unlikely. Do we go to what he calls, and Bruce Blair calls, a deterrence only? Do you reduce your nuclear arsenal so you only can deter, not fight wars? Do you reduce it to your submarines and a small amount of your air platforms that can deliver bombs? Or do you do away with silos and intercontinental ballistic missiles coming out of the United States from land? That's the deterrence only posture. Or where we're going, seem to be going right now, modernize the nuclear arsenal, and then negotiate. So where do I was asked by one of my colleagues, so why don't you step up and make some predictions if you're so knowledgeable about this? So this is my attempt. I wouldn't say that I'm of the view that there is necessarily a high probability of having nuclear war in South Asia, but I think a lot of nuclear experts do look at the Pakistan-India situation and worry about that it could go into something, evolve into something that escalates into nuclear. And certainly, in some people's mind, the most dangerous scenario. Second of all, I think there's no question that North Korea and Iran remain, that's the second bullet, remain the most troublesome. And I think that's obvious. And so getting some type of regime control there, arms control agreement, I think is very critical. Third, I think we're watching and seeing the Chinese nuclear arsenal is gaining. We're now calling this a peer competitor, or a great power competition. And I think we don't have any mechanisms. We don't have any mechanisms with nuclear, even if they've only got 300 or so nuclear weapons. We don't have an agreement. And ironically, in 2005, around that period of time, the Russians actually came to the United States and asked us, don't you think we ought to have a global INF treaty that included the Chinese and others in it? And I think that's something that is playing on the Trump administration's mind now. The Russian nuclear revitalization is worrisome. And at the minimum, I think there ought to be a pause here, and I think we ought to extend for another 5 years the New START Treaty and just let it go at that until some of the other issues that are impinging upon U.S.-Russian relations are settled. The domestic issues here are such that I'm not sure you could get a consensus among the American people or representatives as to how to proceed. So I think the cautious road would be to go ahead and extend it. I think we need some other security architectures, particularly conventional deterrence and reassuring our allies around the world, and that aspect of it. And this is an area that, the last one is an area that also discusses your point last week, which is the cyber. How are cyber attacks going to be able to, if you will, trick our own weapon systems to actually attack ourselves? And there has been a lot of discussion over the last few months about how cyber will influence command and control and communication systems and how it might actually be used against using our own nuclear weapons against ourselves. So I think that's an element of arms control that hasn't been discussed. How do we do this? I think it requires a certain level of improving communication, that we can't afford to become, I'll use a word that I'm not particularly care for, but isolationist in a sense. We've got to keep up those dialogues. We've got to see that, and the Russians certainly, this is a case where Aegis Ashore, which is the Aegis, the radar and interceptors in Europe, as an example, the Russians see those as provocative. Convincing them that it's a defensive system is difficult because they see that as not particularly true, but we have to try to also show them that this is for defensive purposes only. Empathy, as I mentioned, and then try to formulate a policy that has balance between deterrence and a willingness to ensure that we know and have credibility. And that's going to be one of the biggest challenges. And then, as I said, creating a military force that is strong and flexible for both periods. So with that, I will end in that very wave-top assessment of a very sobering topic, and one that's complex enough that to do that in 60 minutes, I'll wait for your feedback, and that'll give me an impression of how well I did or not.